That night, when the steel lock clicked shut outside the wine cellar, my husband thought he had buried me beneath my own home. His mistress believed forged signatures could erase me from this vineyard. But they made one fatal mistake. They locked me inside the only room with a sealed corridor, an independent camera server, and the exact files needed to destroy them. They thought I was trapped in the dark. Instead, they locked themselves inside my trap. My name is Brooklyn Cox. At 37 years old, I make a very comfortable living dissecting the lies people tell about the ground beneath their feet. As a title risk analyst for Blackthorn Title Recovery, my entire career is built on a singular, unyielding truth paper never forgets. I am the person they call when a pristine land deed is hiding a forged signature, or when a sudden transfer of ownership smells like a midnight theft. I spend my days tracing the invisible threads of property ownership, unearthing the fraudulent schemes that desperate people use to steal what does not belong to them. It is a job that requires a cynical eye, an obsessive attention to detail, and a heart that does not flutter at a convincing sob story. Over the past 15 years in this industry, I have seen every trick in the book. That same cynical eye is what led me to Fox Briar House, perched on a sweeping vineyard hill in Loudoun County, Virginia. The estate is a masterpiece of surviving history. When I bought it prior to my marriage, it was breathing its last breaths, sagging under the weight of decades of neglect. But I saw the brilliant bones underneath the rot. I spent the better part of 7 years pouring my soul, and hundreds of thousands of dollars from my own accounts, into its restoration. The crown jewel of the property is the stone wine cellar, a cavernous, perfectly climate-controlled sanctuary dating back to the late 19th century. I personally oversaw every agonizing detail of its reconstruction, from the custom oak rack installations to the independent humidity sensors that maintain a perfect 55 degrees Fahrenheit. It is my fortress, a physical testament to my hard work and independence. I share this fortress with my husband, Reed Mercer. When we first met 5 years ago, Reed was intoxicating. He was charming, aggressively ambitious, and possessed an uncanny ability to play the role of a man whose brilliant, wealthy future was just days away from arriving. He wore success like a bespoke suit, projecting an aura of invincibility even before he had earned a single dime of actual profit. But over the past 3 years, that tailored suit has begun to fray severely at the seams. Reed is currently suffocating in the quicksand of his own creation, a fictionalized, high-end membership service startup he named HelioNest Hospitality. HelioNest is a financial black hole disguised as a visionary enterprise. It consumes cash at an astonishing, terrifying rate. Reed pivots the company's core strategy every 4 to 6 months, desperately chasing whatever buzzword is currently trending in the venture capital circles. He changes his executive staff as often as he changes his luxury watches, firing people the moment they dare to question his erratic, ego-driven direction. Yet, despite the bleeding balance sheets, the angry investors, and the fundamentally hollow product, Reed absolutely refuses to drop the facade. He continues to attend every high-profile networking gala in Washington, orders $300 bottles of wine at business dinners, and speaks loudly to anyone who will listen about being a founder on the verge of a massive, industry-disrupting breakthrough. The quiet, ugly truth of our marriage is that while Reed plays the billionaire visionary for his peers, I am the one keeping the literal lights on at home. I am the invisible, uncredited scaffolding holding up his glittering, precarious life. My steady, substantial income from Blackthorn Title Recovery pays for the exorbitant estate maintenance of Fox Briar House. I pay the crushing annual property taxes. I pay the comprehensive property insurance premiums. I cover the staggering electrical costs required to run the wine preservation system 24 hours a day, and I quietly absorb nearly every single major living expense we incur. Reed's money is always conveniently tied up in the next series funding round, always just around the corner, always an empty promise rather than a tangible bank deposit. I could tolerate the financial imbalance for a while, assuming it was the heavy price of supporting a spouse's ambitious dream. What I could not tolerate was the sudden, calculated shift in his vocabulary. Around 2 months ago, Reed stopped talking about his startup's internal metrics and started talking about our home. The phrases bled into his casual conversation over morning coffee or evening drinks, delivered with a rehearsed casualness that made my skin crawl. He would mention the absolute tragedy of letting sleeping assets remain dormant in such a dynamic real estate market. He brought up the concept of restructuring our family assets to optimize our liquid capital. He talked extensively about unlocking the hidden value of the house to create a robust wealth generation engine. To a normal wife, this might sound like the harmless, slightly annoying jargon of a business-obsessed husband trying to optimize his life, but I am not a normal wife. I am a title risk analyst. When a man who produces zero actual revenue suddenly starts looking at the roof over his head as an unexploited capital resource, the alarm bells do not just ring, they deafen. I knew immediately that Reed was no longer looking at Foxbriar House as our shared sanctuary. He was looking at it as a bank vault, and he was actively trying to figure out how to blow the heavy steel door off its hinges to get to the cash hidden inside. Then came the physical manifestation of his mounting desperation, Vivian Hart. Reed brought her into our home under the guise of a professional consultation, introducing her as a boutique real estate broker who doubled as his new capital strategy advisor. Vivienne was sharp, impeccably dressed in dark designer suits, and possessed the kind of aggressive poise that usually masks a profound lack of basic human ethics. She wore stiletto heels that clicked sharply against my restored hardwood floors, a harsh, intrusive sound that immediately set my teeth on edge every time she crossed the threshold. It was not just her physical presence that bothered me. It was her eyes. I watched her intensely the first evening she came over for introductory drinks. As she moved through the house, her gaze did not sweep over the architecture with the polite, warm appreciation of a normal guest. When she looked at the exposed stone walls of the living room, the custom mahogany shelving in the library, or the heavy iron door of my wine cellar, her eyes narrowed imperceptibly. I had seen that exact look countless times sitting across the table from fraudsters and corporate vultures in my line of work. It was not the gaze of someone admiring a beautiful historic home. It was the cold, calculating appraisal of a predator pricing a fresh carcass. She was doing rapid mental math, stripping the rich history and the immense love from the walls and replacing them with quick, dirty dollar signs. The true horror of betrayal does not usually announce itself with dramatic screaming or the sound of shattered glass in the middle of the night. It arrives softly, wearing a warm, familiar smile. This entire nightmare began in earnest exactly 1 week ago, during a period when Reed suddenly reverted to the charming, attentive man I had married. The erratic, perpetually stressed startup founder vanished overnight. In his place was a deeply present, impossibly tender husband. He started waking up 45 minutes early just to brew my favorite coffee. He kissed my forehead lingeringly before I left for the Blackthorn office. He asked detailed questions about my day and actually pretended to listen to the answers. And then, at the end of that perfectly orchestrated week, he made the suggestion. His voice was smooth, laced with a flawless imitation of deep affection, as he suggested we host a private, intimate anniversary dinner. Just the two of us, he insisted, right here at Foxbriar House. He said he wanted to celebrate our shared history and our love in the very place we had built together. It was a flawless, Oscar-worthy performance of marital devotion. But as he smiled at me across the marble kitchen island, his eyes were entirely dead, completely devoid of any real warmth. I felt a cold knot tighten hard in my stomach. The man standing in front of me was meticulously arranging the lighting and the menu for a romantic evening in the exact house he was secretly conspiring to steal right out of my hands. He thought I was blind to the poison he was so carefully pouring into my glass. He did not realize I had already spent a lifetime learning exactly how to taste it. The alert came through at exactly 9:14 on a Tuesday morning. It was a silent digital ping, but to my trained ears, it was as loud as a gunshot. The notification from the Loudoun County Property Records portal indicated someone had pulled the plat map and deed history for parcel number 472. That is the exact legal footprint of Foxbriar House. Because I work in title recovery, I maintain active, aggressive monitoring on my own assets. I immediately logged into the system to trace the Internet Protocol address, but the query had been deliberately executed through a guest account. It was entirely anonymous, untraceable. Most people would swipe the notification away, assuming it was a system glitch or a random public record search by a bored neighbor. But my entire career is built on the premise that there are no harmless anomalies in real estate. 2 days later, the digital ghost materialized into physical evidence. I was searching for a spare fountain pen in Reed's home office. His mahogany desk was a chaotic landscape of unpaid HelioNest invoices and empty espresso cups. Partially hidden beneath a stack of non-disclosure agreements was a glossy, half-printed brochure. It was a prospectus for a high-end luxury resort development proposed for the adjacent hillside. I slid the thick paper out and studied the site map. The architectural renderings were gorgeous, all glass and natural timber, but my eyes immediately locked onto the main access road. According to the architect's dotted lines, the grand entrance to this new resort sliced directly through my south vineyard. It cut right through land that belonged exclusively to me. You do not print out a resort map showing a paved road through your wife's property unless you have a vested interest in seeing that road built. That same evening, Reed poured me a glass of expensive Cabernet and casually leaned against the marble kitchen counter. He did not ask about my day. He did not ask about my active fraud cases. Instead, he asked about the legal framing of the estate. "Just out of curiosity," he began, his voice a perfectly calibrated mask of mild, husbandly interest. "How exactly is the house titled? I remember you mentioning you put it in a trust or something before we got married." I took a very slow sip of the wine, letting the heavy red liquid coat my tongue to buy a second of time. "An LLC," I corrected softly. "Blue Ash Holdings, LLC. Why do you ask?" He waved his free hand dismissively, offering a practiced, boyish smile. "Just thinking about liability." With the startup raising new capital, my lawyers were mentioning the importance of shielding personal assets from corporate fallout. I was wondering how ironclad your setup really is. Does the LLC own the house and the adjoining vineyard land outright, or are there separate entities? My pulse tapped a quiet, warning rhythm against my throat. Spouses ask about market value. They ask about home equity lines of credit to remodel the kitchen or build a pool. They absolutely do not ask about the structural integrity of a prenuptial holding company unless they are actively trying to find a crack in its armor. The suspicion crystallized into cold, hard certainty the following afternoon. Vivian dropped by the house to deliver some supposed strategic planning documents for Reed. I was in the foyer, organizing the incoming mail. We exchanged the usual hollow, polite pleasantries. Then, her eyes drifted downward, locking onto the antique brass floor vents near the baseboards. "Your climate control system must work absolute overtime," she noted, offering a thin, predatory smile that did not reach her eyes. "Maintaining exactly 55 degrees in a stone cellar of that size is no small feat, especially given the 42-inch width of that old bottling corridor underneath. The draft must be immense." I froze. I kept my facial muscles entirely neutral, but the air in my lungs turned to ice. I had never, not once in 5 years, told Reed the exact dimensions of the sub-level transport corridor. Furthermore, the independent climate control system and its exact temperature protocols were purely my domain. The only way Vivian could possibly know the specific temperature setting and the exact width of a sealed Prohibition-era tunnel was if she had been meticulously studying my private architectural blueprints. The cast of characters in this silent, threatening play was rapidly expanding. On Friday morning, I looked out the kitchen window while pouring coffee and saw Nolan Mercer lurking near the service entrance. Nolan is Reed's cousin. He is a man who floats through life as a half-baked handyman and a full-time scavenger of antique building materials. He had a yellow steel tape measure pulled taut across the heavy oak frame of the back door. I stepped outside, letting the screen door slap shut behind me. "Nolan?" What exactly are you doing? He jumped, the tape measure snapping back into its plastic casing with a sharp crack. Oh, hey, Brooklyn. Reed asked me to come take a look at these hinges. He said the door was sticking. Thought I could help swap out the brass to make it swing easier. The door was not sticking. It swung perfectly on oiled, custom-forged hinges. And Nolan did not swap hinges to be helpful. He stripped historic homes of valuable, irreplaceable fixtures to sell to architectural salvage yards for quick cash. He was not measuring for repairs. He was measuring the estate for extraction. The pieces were assembling themselves into a guillotine. On Saturday, while preparing to take Reed's heavy wool overcoat to the dry cleaners, my fingers brushed against a thick, stiff piece of cardstock hidden deep in the inner breast pocket. I pulled it out. It was black linen paper, stamped with embossed gold lettering. The card read, Russell Pike, Mobile Public Notary, available 24 hours. I know the name Russell Pike. Anyone who works in the Virginia title recovery industry knows that name. He is the ghost in the machine of the private closing world. If you need a rush transfer, a blind eye turned to a forged signature, or a midnight closing with absolutely zero questions asked, you call Russell Pike. He is a bottom feeder who operates in the grayest, dirtiest margins of real estate law. A legitimate tech startup founder has absolutely zero reason to carry the card of a dirty mobile notary in his coat pocket. I walked straight down the stone steps into the wine cellar. The air was cool, smelling faintly of old damp wood and cork. I walked slowly down the center aisle, my eyes scanning the meticulously organized rows of vintage bottles. Halfway down the left stone wall, I stopped dead. The heavy, floor-to-ceiling antique oak rack was out of alignment. It was a microscopic deviation, maybe a quarter of an inch, but I am the person who measured and installed them. The faint dust line on the stone floor was visibly broken. Someone had been down here, pulling at the heavy wooden shelving, searching for something hidden behind the racks. I did not confront Reed. I did not scream, and I did not ask frantic questions. Panic is the luxury of the unprepared, and I do not afford myself luxuries that compromise my safety. Instead, I went into my home office, locked the solid wood door, and closed the blinds. I pulled every original, hard copy document regarding Blue Ash Holdings, LLC from my fireproof floor safe. I meticulously scanned the operating agreement, the deed of trust, the vineyard covenants, and the original owner's title policy. I uploaded the entire encrypted packet to a secure, off-site cloud drive that Reed did not know existed. Next, I logged directly into the county's digital portal, this time bypassing the public interface and using my verified professional credentials. I placed a hard electronic fraud alert on parcel number 472. With that flag active, if anyone tried to file a transfer deed, a lien, or an encumbrance of any kind, the system would immediately freeze the transaction. It would legally require my in-person biometric verification at the county clerk's office to proceed. Finally, I waited until Reed left the house for a supposed evening investor dinner. I went back down into the cellar. I bypassed the shifted racks, moving silently to the far back corner where a nearly invisible brass latch sat flush against the wood paneling. I triggered it, slipping into the dark, narrow bottling corridor Vivian had so brazenly mentioned. At the end of the tunnel was the small, dust-free utility room. I powered up the independent server rack I had installed during the initial restoration. The internal security cameras, which were tiny, hidden lenses positioned in the library, the living room, the foyer, and the cellar itself, flickered to life on my monitor in crisp, high definition. They were entirely separate from the home's primary wireless network, completely immune to any digital tampering Reed might attempt from upstairs. I sat alone in the blue glow of the monitors, watching the empty, quiet rooms of my beautiful house. I still did not know the exact mechanics of their plan. I did not know the precise timeline they were operating on, or how much dirty money they thought they were going to extract from my life. But my profession has taught me one absolute, unbreakable rule of human nature. When someone suddenly stops caring about the living value of a home and becomes obsessively, secretly fixated on its ownership structure. They are not planning a remodel. They are preparing to commit a crime. The anniversary dinner was an absolute masterpiece of calculated misdirection. Reed had perfectly seared scallops resting on the stove, a bottle of sparkling water sweating softly on the marble island, and a jazz record playing at a low, intimate volume in the living room. He poured my water, offered a warm, rehearsed smile, and then his phone buzzed sharply against the countertop. He looked at the screen, and I watched the color drain flawlessly from his face. It was the performance of a lifetime. "The cellar alarm," he said, his voice laced with sudden, sharp panic. "The humidity sensor is throwing a critical error on the main dashboard. The compressor might be failing. Your reserve Pinot Noir collection is going to cook if we do not bypass the system right now." It was the perfect bait, hooked precisely into my vulnerabilities. He knew I had spent a decade curating those specific bottles, carefully sourcing rare vintages from the late 1990s. I did not pause to grab a sweater or ask a single question. I practically ran down the main hallway, my heels clicking rapidly against the hardwood, and threw open the heavy wooden door leading to the subterranean stairs. The air hit me first. It was crisp, perfectly chilled, and smelling faintly of damp stone and aged cork. The climate control system was humming along flawlessly. It was not failing at all. But as I rounded the curve of the spiraling stone staircase, the breath caught instantly in my throat. Vivian was standing at the bottom of the stairs, perfectly centered in the main tasting aisle. She was wearing a tailored charcoal suit and sharp, black leather stilettos that rested elegantly against the rough, freezing stone. She stood with her arms loosely crossed, exuding the smug, comfortable posture of a new owner waiting to take inventory of her newly acquired kingdom. I spun around, my mouth opening to demand what the hell this woman was doing standing in the private depths of my home. Reed was standing on the landing above me. His eyes were completely vacant, entirely stripped of the loving husband facade he had worn just 3 minutes prior. He did not say a single word. He reached out, grabbed the heavy forged steel handle of the security door, and pulled it shut with a massive, echoing slam that rattled the wine racks. Then came the sound. It was not the familiar smooth click of the standard mortise lock I had meticulously researched and installed. It was the heavy, brutal metallic scrape of a solid steel deadbolt sliding deep into a reinforced strike plate. It was a secondary lock, a lock that had absolutely not been there yesterday morning. They had brought someone in to drill directly into the historic stone frame and mount a commercial-grade barricade just for this exact moment. I slammed my palms against the thick steel, the cold metal biting sharply into my skin. "Reed, open this door right now," I screamed, the sound bouncing violently off the vaulted brick ceiling and dying in the dark corners of the room. A sharp burst of static crackled through the chilled air. It came from the antique brass intercom speaker mounted near the ventilation shaft, a vintage architectural quirk I had restored, so I could communicate with contractors while I was working downstairs. "Save your voice, Brooklyn," Vivian said. The old intercom severely distorted her tone, making it sound entirely robotic and terrifyingly detached. "The door is sealed. The acoustic paneling you installed down there means nobody outside the property boundaries can hear you scream. And you are going to be down there for the next 2 hours. "Reed," I demanded, ignoring the mistress entirely and speaking directly to the man who had sworn an oath to protect me. "What exactly is this?" "It is survival," Reed replied over the speaker, his voice a tight, defensive snarl. Gone was the charming, confident visionary. This was the voice of a cornered, rabid animal. "I am drowning, Brooklyn. Helio Nest is completely underwater. My investors are threatening litigation. My reputation, my future, everything I have built is collapsing. And you are sitting on millions of dollars of dead capital. This house is a brick tomb that produces absolutely nothing. I need cash flow tonight. I am not asking for your permission anymore." "We have a cash buyer," Vivian interjected smoothly, as if she were reading from a sanitized corporate agenda. "Cinder Vale Development. The closing is happening right upstairs in your formal dining room in exactly 1 hour and 45 minutes. It is an emergency private transfer." All we need from you is one simple act of cooperation." I pressed my forehead against the freezing steel door, feeling the icy reality wash over my skin. My professional brain, the title risk analyst who dismantled property fraud for a living, immediately overrode the panic of the betrayed wife. "You cannot sell a house you do not own. Read. The title is firmly locked in my holding company. Any legitimate closing attorney will laugh you out of the room the second they look at the vesting deed." "They would, if you were not signing the documents," Vivian said, her voice dripping with condescension. "But you are signing them. We have a limited power of attorney drafted and ready to go. We just triggered a digital signature request to your cellular phone. All you have to do is read us the 6-digit two-factor authentication code that just arrived in your messages. You give us the code. Our private notary stamps the proxy, and Cinder Vale wires the funds into a joint escrow account. It is clean, it is fast, and you get out of the dark before midnight. And the notary is just going to blindly accept my physical absence at a multi-million-dollar closing," I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, steady whisper. "You are not absent," Reed said, a sick note of pride bleeding heavily into his words. "You are at a highly exclusive, silent wellness retreat in New Mexico. We have been telling our friends in your office for a week that you needed a severe mental health reset and wanted absolutely no contact with the outside world. And for the title underwriter, Vivian had her tech guy splice together a video from those old continuing education webinars you recorded last year. It is a perfect, seamless visual clip of you confirming your voluntary consent to the remote proxy. We tested it against standard verification software. It passes every single basic visual check. The upstairs is already staged," Vivian added, twisting the knife deeper. "We moved your personal files into storage boxes. We swapped the family photos for neutral art. To the private lender and the buyer walking in tonight, this is a clean, unencumbered asset ready for immediate transfer. Just give us the code. Brooklyn, do not make this infinitely harder than it has to be. If you fight this, Reed goes to federal prison for investor fraud by the end of the month, and he will drag you and your pristine professional career down with him in the media fallout. Give us the code, and we will unlock the bolt the second the wire clears." I stood perfectly still in the center of the subterranean room. The smell of damp oak filled my lungs, grounding me. This was no longer a sudden crime of passion. This was not a desperate husband making a single catastrophic choice in the heat of an argument. This was a premeditated, highly coordinated property heist. They had weaponized my own sanctuary against me, utilizing forged paper, a fabricated alibi, and a steel cage to steal my life's work. My husband genuinely thought he had buried me alive. The mistress genuinely thought she had outsmarted a senior title risk analyst on her own territory. I stopped banging on the door. I pulled my hands back and methodically smoothed the fabric of my silk blouse. I looked up at the tiny, glowing red light of the intercom camera that Reed had so painstakingly installed to watch me break. I did not scream again. I did not beg for my freedom. I did not shed a single tear for the violent death of my marriage. Instead, a terrifying, absolute calm settled heavily over my chest, freezing the blood in my veins. They thought they had trapped me in a dead end. But my husband, in all his arrogant, self-absorbed blindness, had never once paid attention when I explained the extensive architectural history of a 19th-century Virginia vineyard estate. He cared only about the optics of the house, never the bones. He did not know about the space hidden behind the heavy wooden walls. He did not know that locking me in this specific room was the absolute worst mistake he could have possibly made. I stepped away from the heavy steel door, my breathing already slowing from a frantic rhythm to a measured, deliberate pace. Panic is a useless emotion when you are standing on your own territory. I turned my back on the intercom speaker, ignoring the dead silence that had settled over the subterranean room, and walked deeper into the cellar. My heels clicked softly against the antique stone floor. I bypassed the newly acquired vintages and moved directly toward the far left wall, where the oldest, heaviest custom oak racks stood bolted to the masonry. During the extensive restoration of this estate, I had spent hours studying the original late 19th century architectural blueprints. I knew every structural secret this house possessed. I ran my fingers along the rough grain of the wood, sliding my hand directly behind a dusty row of reserve Cabernet bottles from 1998. My fingertips brushed against the cold, smooth metal of a small brass pin. It was a mechanism I had personally instructed my head contractor to hide flush against the backing board, completely invisible to the naked eye. I gripped the pin and pulled it sharply to the right. A heavy, satisfying metallic click echoed in the dark. I pushed my shoulder against the edge of the massive shelving unit. The entire section of the oak rack, loaded with hundreds of heavy glass bottles, swung silently outward on heavy duty, concealed industrial hinges. Beyond the rack lay a narrow, dirt-floored passageway. The air inside was dense, carrying the heavy scent of dry earth and ancient, undisturbed dust. This was the original bottling corridor. During the Prohibition era, the previous owners had used this exact subterranean tunnel to quietly roll oak barrels directly from the cellar out to the carriage house, completely avoiding the main road and any prying eyes. My husband cared entirely about the aesthetic value of the wine cellar to impress his wealthy friends, but he had absolutely no interest in its history. He had never once asked what lay behind the wood. I slipped into the dark corridor, pulling the heavy oak rack shut behind me. The lock re-engaged with a quiet snap, sealing me securely inside the hidden tunnel. I pulled my cellular phone from my pocket and activated the flashlight. The narrow beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the damp stone walls. I walked approximately 40 feet down the gentle incline until the tunnel widened, terminating in a compact concrete reinforced utility room. This room was my hidden sanctuary. When I rebuilt the cellar, I demanded an isolated space to house the delicate environmental control systems that protected my expensive wine investments. But I had also used the opportunity to build a secure technological backbone for the entire estate. I reached out and flipped the main breaker switch on the wall. The room instantly hummed to life with a low, steady mechanical drone. The heavy-duty, uninterruptible power supply kicked in, feeding immediate electricity to the independent server rack mounted in the corner. Directly to my right was a solid wood panel set into the concrete. If I pushed that panel, it would pop open a concealed hatch leading directly up into the narrow space behind the old kitchen pantry. From there, I could be out the back service door and standing in the fresh night air in under 45 seconds. I could easily sprint down the driveway, drive my car to the nearest local police precinct, and file a formal report against my husband for unlawful imprisonment and attempted fraud. I could blow up his entire scheme before the ink even touched the paper. I stared at the wooden panel for a long moment. My hand hovered over the latch. Then, I slowly lowered my arm. Escaping through the pantry would only solve the immediate physical threat. It would trigger a chaotic, messy domestic dispute. Reed and his aggressively sharp mistress would simply feign ignorance. They would unlock the cellar door, act horrified, claim the secondary lock was a malfunction, and hire incredibly expensive lawyers to obscure their true intentions. They would retreat, regroup, and try to steal my home again from a different, more sophisticated angle. I did not want to merely survive this betrayal. I wanted to completely annihilate them. I needed an airtight, undeniable chain of evidence that would legally and financially bury them so deep they would never recover. I needed them to cross the point of absolutely no return. I pulled up a heavy metal stool and sat down in front of the server rack. I powered on the dual high-definition monitors resting on the small workstation. The internal camera feeds flickered, ran a quick diagnostic check, and then stabilized into crystal clear, full-color video. I had hidden these tiny, high-resolution lenses within the crown molding, inside vintage light fixtures, and behind the heating grates in every major room of the house. The entire surveillance network was hardwired directly into this room, running on an isolated circuit completely separated from the primary wireless network upstairs. Reed could not disable it, and he certainly could not see it. The monitors offered me a godlike view of the estate above. My beautiful home had been transformed into a perfectly staged theater production for a high-stakes financial grift. In the formal dining room, the ambient lighting was adjusted to a warm, welcoming glow. Expensive crystal wine glasses were already arranged flawlessly on my antique mahogany table. Stacks of crisp, fraudulent legal documents rested perfectly aligned next to expensive leather-bound pens. It was a masterclass in deception, designed to make the impending transaction look completely legitimate to whatever private lender they had dragged into this mess. I needed an insurance policy before I let them proceed. I picked up my cellular phone, grateful for the signal booster I had installed in the utility room ceiling, and opened a highly secure messaging application. I navigated to the contact for Mara Sutter. Mara is my closest friend and, more importantly, one of the most ruthless, brilliant civil litigators in the state of Virginia. I typed a single, explicit instruction. If I do not call you by 6:15, activate the Fox Briar packet. I hit send. The delivery receipt flashed instantly on my screen. Mara already possessed the encrypted digital file I had meticulously compiled over the past week. That packet was a legal weapon of mass destruction. It contained the electronic property fraud alerts I had filed, the pristine original operating agreement for Blue Ash Holdings, LLC, proving my sole ownership, the digital logs showing the anonymous county portal inquiries, and my preemptive sworn affidavit detailing the early signs of forged signatures on the preliminary documents. If the clock struck 6:15 and I remained silent, Mara would unleash a legal firestorm that would instantly freeze the title transfer and summon local law enforcement directly to my front door. I placed my phone face down on the desk and returned my full attention to the surveillance feeds. As the camera over the foyer panned slightly, I saw the heavy oak front door swing open. It was not just Reed and Vivian executing this operation in the shadows. A parade of people began filing into my hallway. These were not anonymous corporate thugs. Through the monitor, I recognized faces I had warmly greeted at my own front door. I saw people I had poured expensive wine for, people I had smiled at across Thanksgiving dinners and summer barbecues. They moved through my house with the arrogant, entitled swagger of thieves who firmly believed they were walking into a bank vault with the safe combination already resting in their pockets. They were admiring the architecture, laughing softly with my husband, treating my cherished home like a slaughtered animal ready to be carved up and divided. The sheer, overwhelming volume of the betrayal washed over me in a cold wave, but instead of crushing my spirit, the sight of those greedy, familiar faces sharpened my focus into a razor edge. In that exact moment, my entire psychological state shifted. The terrified, desperately confused wife, who had pounded her bleeding hands against the steel cellar door a mere 15 minutes ago, ceased to exist. In her place sat the senior title risk analyst, comfortably positioned in the operational command center of her own impregnable fortress. Reed thought he had removed the primary obstacle from the board by tossing me into a dark hole. Vivian thought she was the smartest predator in the room, manipulating a desperate man into handing over a multi-million-dollar asset. They had absolutely no idea that they had just handed the actual owner the ultimate, invisible vantage point. I watched Reed nervously adjust the collar of his expensive shirt in the hallway mirror, his hands visibly shaking. I watched Vivian arrange the fraudulent paperwork with the cold, practiced precision of a surgeon preparing to dissect a body. I made a very simple, very cold decision sitting in the blue glow of the monitors. I was not going to interrupt their performance. I was going to let them get completely comfortable in their stolen victory. I would sit in the silence and let them pour the expensive wine. I would let them exchange their greedy, triumphant smiles. I would let them speak their felonies out loud into the room, captured perfectly by my hidden microphones. I would patiently wait for them to press their pens to the paper and legally sign their own professional and literal death warrants. I was going to wait until every single bridge was completely burned to ash, until the trap they had so carefully built for me was entirely sealed tightly around their own necks. Only then, when they had absolutely nowhere left to run, would I step out of the shadows and let the house itself crush them. The camera feed hovering above the grand foyer showed the heavy custom oak door swinging wide open. Into my home walked Owen Danner. He was the chief executive officer of Cindervale Development, a man whose entire reputation in Loudoun County was built on aggressively swallowing up pristine pastoral land and vomiting out overpriced, soulless luxury subdivisions. He did not bother to wipe his expensive leather loafers on the woven entry mat, tracking dry mud directly onto my antique Persian rug. Tucked tightly under his left arm was a pair of thick, rolled architectural blueprints. He strode into the center of my house with the unmistakable, relaxed swagger of a man who firmly believed he had already purchased the entire hillside, dirt and all. But Owen was not the guest that made the blood freeze in my veins. Trailing right behind him, stepping delicately over the threshold, was a woman dressed in a sweeping emerald silk dress. She looked as though she were arriving at a highly anticipated victory gala rather than participating in a midnight real estate theft. It was Celeste Mercer, my mother-in-law. Following closely behind her, his eyes darting hungrily across my custom mahogany wainscoting and vintage light fixtures, was Nolan, the cousin who had pretended to measure my door hinges just days ago to help out. The scale of this operation suddenly expanded into something terrifyingly vast. This was not just a rogue, desperate husband and his sharp-toothed mistress trying to pull a fast one. It was a highly coordinated, multi-layered family effort to strip me entirely to the bone. I reached out with a trembling hand and toggled the audio master switch on the server rack, feeding the concealed library and dining room microphones directly into my heavy noise-canceling headphones. The voices crackled to life, crystal clear in the quiet utility room. They were gathered around the massive dining table now. I watched Owen unfurl the large paper plans, flattening the edges against the polished wood. I listened, my fingernails digging hard into my palms, as the true, horrifying scope of the conspiracy finally laid itself bare. They did not want to sell Fox Briarhouse to a wealthy family. They did not even want to flip it to an aggressive corporate investor. They wanted to completely obliterate it. The primary access road has to cut straight through the South Vineyard. Owen's deep, booming voice echoed harshly through my headphones. He tapped a heavy gold pen against the paper rendering. But the real prize, the only reason we are standing in this room tonight, is the subterranean aquifer. Our geological surveys confirmed last month that the main artery of the underground spring runs directly beneath the stone foundation of this exact house. Without unlimited, unrestricted access to that water source, the luxury resort project next door is completely dead in the dirt. We absolutely cannot build a high-capacity wellness spa and 36 private plunge pools on a municipal trickle. I paid you a massive, unprecedented premium. Read, to permanently eliminate the obstacles standing in my way. I expect this deed clean, stamped, and recorded by sunrise. And it will be, Owen, Vivian chimed in, her voice dripping with an oily, confident reassurance that made me nauseous. Once the transfer is executed tonight, my firm takes immediate operational control. First thing Monday morning, I have a friendly structural engineer ready to file a highly unfavorable foundation assessment with the county. We will document severe, irreparable moisture damage spreading from the wine cellar and claim the load-bearing stone walls are fatally compromised. The county will condemn the structure within 14 days as a public hazard. We will have the bulldozers on the property and this entire place flattened to dirt in less than 3 weeks. Your excavators will have a clear, legal shot at the aquifer before the end of the month. The breath shuddered violently out of my lungs, catching in my throat. Flattened to dirt, my home, my absolute sanctuary. The years of agonizing restoration, the endless hours spent sourcing authentic materials, all of it reduced to a fabricated mold report and a wrecking ball. Thank God, Celeste said, her voice floating through the audio feed with casual, vicious delight. She accepted a tall glass of expensive champagne from Vivian, taking a celebratory sip. I have spent 5 years watching my brilliant son suffocate under the weight of a woman who guards her assets like a steel bank vault. She never truly supported his vision or his company. She just sat in this drafty old museum, hoarding her paychecks and playing the martyr. It is about time you took back what you rightfully deserve. Read. You are finally cutting the dead weight. Speaking of taking things, Nolan interjected smoothly, leaning casually against the doorframe of the formal dining room. If the house is getting reduced to rubble in 3 weeks anyway, I assume I get first pick of the architectural salvage. That antique brass chandelier in the foyer easily pulls $5,000 at a private auction. And the custom copper gutters outside are worth their weight in scrap alone. Do not let the demolition crew crush the good stuff. Sitting at the far end of the long table, entirely ignored until this exact moment, was Russell Pike. The mobile notary slouched deeply in his upholstered chair, tapping a thick banded stack of $100 bills against his palm. I do not care if you burn the place down or sell it brick by brick, Russell muttered, his voice raspy, cynical, and utterly bored. I am simply here to stamp the proxy document and verify the identification provided on the table. My exorbitant fee covers the ink on my stamp and my absolute, unwavering silence. Whatever moral acrobatics you people are doing to justify stealing a historic house from a missing wife is none of my business. Just make absolutely sure the paperwork has no glaring typographical errors, because I am not losing my state commission over a misspelled middle name or a botched date. I shifted my gaze back to the monitor showing Reed. He was staring down at his hands, resting on the table. I waited for a flicker of hesitation. I waited for the man I married to show a single ounce of remorse for agreeing to aggressively demolish the home we supposedly built our life inside. I waited for him to defend my name against his mother's venom. Instead, Reed looked up at Owen and nodded with a terrifying firmness. I need the capital injection into the HelioNest accounts by tomorrow at noon. Owen, I am not just taking a temporary bridge loan against the equity like we initially discussed last year. I am completely wiping her off the map. All of her ridiculous historical preservation, all of her obsessive restorations. I am trading it all so my company can survive the next quarter. I delivered the asset. I locked her away. You deliver the cash. The sheer brutality of the betrayal was a sharp, physical ache in my ribs, radiating through my chest. But the final, shocking revelation came from Owen, and it perfectly explained the frantic, dangerously sloppy execution of their entire plan. The funds are sitting in the escrow account right now. Read, Owen snapped, rolling the thick blueprints back into a tight cylinder and pointing it at my husband like a weapon. But the title must be legally transferred tonight. Not tomorrow afternoon. Tonight, the County Water Management Board is holding an emergency legislative session at exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. They are voting on a sweeping district-wide moratorium that will permanently freeze all new commercial water extraction permits. If my corporate entity does not officially own the land above that aquifer before the judge drops the gavel tomorrow morning, the resort cannot draw a single drop of water, and this entire multi-million-dollar deal turns to ash. We are operating on a razor-thin wire. Reed, that is exactly why we are doing a midnight closing with a dirty notary and a forged proxy. We are literally racing the sun. I sat back in my metal chair, staring at the screens. The cold concrete walls of the hidden utility room suddenly felt less like a cage and more like a hardened command bunker. The puzzle pieces locked together with a sickening crunch. This was never just a simple property theft. This was a desperate, multi-million-dollar corporate sabotage disguised as a marital betrayal. They were backed against a sheer cliff, utterly dependent on a forged signature, a corrupt family, and a locked cellar door to save their miserable lives before the morning sun exposed them all. I turned my attention to the secondary control panel mounted on the concrete wall to my left. This was the master digital interface for the exterior landscape matrix. They wanted the cover of a pitch-black Loudoun County night to hide their illicit gathering, wrapping their crime in a comfortable blanket of rural darkness. I reached out and tapped the glowing touchscreen, manually overriding the automated sunset timer. Instantly, thousands of watts of high-intensity security halogens blazed to life across the entire hillside. The sweeping vineyard rows, the winding gravel approach, and the grand front perimeter of the estate were suddenly bathed in a blinding, clinical white glare. It looked less like a secluded luxury property and more like an active federal crime scene under police spotlights. I stripped away their shadows with a single touch. Next, I accessed the zoned irrigation controls. I had noticed through the cameras that they had parked their expensive vehicles carelessly along the crushed stone of the side lawn, deliberately avoiding the main turnaround to remain hidden from the road. I activated zones 4 through 7, pushing the system to maximum pressure. The heavy-duty agricultural sprinklers shot up from the earth with a violent, mechanical hiss. Through the external camera feeds, I watched arcs of high-velocity water instantly turn the dry dirt into thick, churning mud. The deluge hammered aggressively against the polished hoods of their imported sedans. I saw Owen flinch near the dining room window as the spray caught the edge of his pristine leather shoes and the bottom of his tailored trousers where he had been standing just moments before on the terrace. The mud splashed wildly, coating the heavy tubes holding his blueprints. It destroyed the clean, untouchable illusion they had carried inside. While they were distracted by the sudden floodlights and the chaotic sound of water blasting against the glass, I triggered the electronic deadbolt on the rear service gate. A heavy magnetic slam echoed faintly through the structure, a sound I felt more than heard down in the bunker. Now, the only functional exit or entry point for vehicles was the main wrought iron gate, which was directly monitored by 3 high-definition, infrared cameras. Nobody was slipping away into the night unnoticed. If they panicked and ran, I would have their license plates, their tire tracks, and their terrified faces recorded in stunning 4,000-pixel resolution. I was building a digital cage around the physical one they thought they had put me in. Then, I set the clock. I opened my encrypted email client and drafted a new message, attaching the entire comprehensive fraud alert packet I had previously queued up for my lawyer. But this time, I set the recipients as the lead underwriter for the title insurance company and the senior loan officer at the private lending firm underwriting Owen's purchase. I configured an automated delayed send protocol. If I did not manually enter a complex alphanumeric override password in exactly 20 minutes, the system would automatically blast the undeniable proof of their forgery directly to the people holding the money. The power dynamic shifted violently in that single keystroke. Reed thought he was racing the morning sun and the county water board. He had absolutely no idea he was actually racing a 20-minute countdown clock ticking silently beneath his feet. Now it was time to drop the match directly into the gasoline. I opened my archived audio files on the server. Months ago, I had noticed Vivian and Owen lingering alone in my tasting room after a supposed casual wine event Reed had hosted. I had reviewed the security footage out of sheer professional habit, capturing a fascinating, highly destructive private conversation they thought was completely off the record. I routed the audio output from my server directly into the integrated ceiling speakers of the formal dining room upstairs. I cranked the digital volume to 75% and hit play. The smooth, venomous voice of my husband's mistress suddenly dropped from the ceiling, echoing clearly and loudly over the crystal glasses and the forged documents resting on the table. The second the wire transfer clears escrow and the deed is recorded, we cut him loose, the recorded Vivian stated, her tone dripping with absolute freezing contempt. Reed is a sinking ship. A desperate man is incredibly easy to use to get the asset we need, but he is absolutely not worth keeping around for the development phase. We bleed him dry on the consulting fees and sever the contract entirely by the end of the quarter. I leaned much closer to the monitor, watching the psychological explosion detonate in real time. Reed froze entirely, the color instantly and completely draining from his face as he stared at the ceiling speaker. His jaw dropped, his eyes wide with a mixture of profound shock and total, crushing humiliation. He slowly turned his head to look at Vivian, realizing in real time that the woman he was destroying his marriage for, the woman he was risking federal prison for, was actively planning to throw him to the wolves the moment the ink dried. Owen did not look surprised by the audio, but he looked incredibly dangerous. He slowly turned his heavy head toward Vivian, his eyes narrowing into 2 cold, calculating slits. He was looking at her with the pure, unadulterated suspicion of an apex predator who suddenly realizes his hunting partner might be perfectly willing to shoot him in the back if the price was right. If she was willing to discard Reed so ruthlessly, Owen knew he was inevitably next on her chopping block. The tense, suffocating silence lasted only 3 seconds before the alliance completely shattered. Celeste slammed her champagne flute onto the table, the sparkling liquid spilling over the rim and staining the fraudulent paperwork. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at Vivian's face. "You treacherous little viper," my mother-in-law hissed, her voice trembling with raw, unhinged rage. "You used my son. You promised us a clean exit strategy, and you were planning to steal his equity the entire time. You parasitic little fraud." Vivian did not cower. She stepped back, her posture defensive but vicious, her sharp features twisting into an ugly sneer. "Oh, please, Celeste," she snapped, abandoning any pretense of polite professionalism. "Do not stand there and pretend you have any moral high ground in this room. If it were not for you and your son's blind, pathetic greed, none of us would be taking these massive legal shortcuts tonight. You practically begged me to find a way to liquidate this house because Reed has burned through every single cent of his investors' cash. I provided the buyer. I provided the strategy. If I take a larger cut, it is because I am the only one carrying the actual brains in this operation." From the far corner of the table, the harsh scraping of a wooden chair violently pushed back drew everyone's frantic attention. Russell Pike was standing up, hurriedly shoving his heavy brass notary stamp back into his worn leather briefcase. The lazy boredom was completely gone from his face, replaced by a twitching, panicked energy. "Is this title actually clean?" Russell demanded, his voice rising in pitch, his eyes darting frantically between Reed and the documents resting on the mahogany wood. "Because I am telling you all right now, if there is a single electronic fraud alert tied to this parcel, or if this proxy is anything less than ironclad, my role in this room changes from an independent contractor to a co-conspirator in a multi-million-dollar real property theft. I do not do federal prison time for sloppy domestic disputes and amateur hour grifts." Down in the damp, freezing utility room, a slow, genuine smile finally crept across my face. I sat back in the metal chair, the heavy silence of the underground bunker contrasting sharply with the chaotic screaming echoing through my headphones. My beautiful historic house was cracking them apart, piece by piece, utilizing nothing but their own arrogance and a few calculated volts of electricity. The first counterattack was a flawless, devastating victory. They had walked into my home believing they were an unbreakable, brilliant team, but from this exact moment forward, the people upstairs would fear each other almost as much as they were about to fear me. The sharp, demanding ping of an incoming priority email cut through the heavy, toxic silence in the dining room. Owen reached into the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and withdrew his cellular phone. His thick thumb swiped across the illuminated glass. I zoomed in on his face using the high-definition camera mounted above the chandelier. The aggressive, confident posture of the wealthy developer instantly evaporated. The muscles in his jaw tightened so intensely I could practically hear his teeth grinding together over the audio feed. "This is from the lead underwriter at the title insurance firm," Owen growled, his voice dropping an entire octave into a dangerous, gravelly register. He did not look up from the screen. "They are officially red-flagging the preliminary file your office submitted this afternoon. Vivian, they are demanding the physical, original wet ink operating agreement for the holding company. They also want the notarized, original proxy resolution. And most importantly, they are refusing to authorize the release of any escrow funds until they receive direct live verbal verification from Brooklyn herself before a single piece of paper is filed with the county clerk." Reed immediately stepped forward, raising both hands in a placating, desperately frantic gesture. "Owen, listen to me. This is just a standard procedural check. It happens all the time with high-value commercial transfers. We just need to push the documents through tonight as planned. I will have my attorney smooth over the underwriter tomorrow morning. It is a minor administrative hurdle." But while my husband was attempting to play the seasoned businessman, I was watching Vivian. The sharp, ruthless real estate broker had turned the color of old parchment. Her heavily manicured hands were actually trembling as she stared at the forged documents resting on the mahogany table. She knew exactly what I knew. Those digitally spliced proxy forms and laser-printed signatures would not survive 10 seconds of genuine, forensic legal scrutiny from a seasoned title underwriter. The smell of blood in the water was too much for Celeste to ignore. My mother-in-law stepped away from the ruined, champagne-soaked table and rounded on her son with vicious, uncontained fury. "Administrative hurdle," Celeste shrieked, the elegant facade of the wealthy matriarch completely shattering. "You arrogant, incompetent fool. You told me this was a guaranteed, flawless exit strategy. I leveraged my entire social reputation in this county for you. I took out a second mortgage of $450,000 against the family estate to keep your ridiculous hospitality startup afloat for the last 8 months. You swore to me on your father's grave that the capital injection from this house sale would make me whole by Friday afternoon. Where is my money? Reed. Tell me right now that my money is not already vaporized in your useless corporate accounts." Reed stumbled backward, physically shrinking away from his mother's rage. He opened his mouth, but only a pathetic, stammering noise came out. The truth was written perfectly across his sweating, terrified face. The borrowed $500,000 was entirely gone, swallowed completely by the black hole of his failed ambition. He had burned through his investors' cash, his mother's secret loans, and now he was trying to burn down my house just to keep himself out of a federal courtroom. From the shadows of the foyer, Nolan shifted his weight awkwardly, completely oblivious to the massive legal catastrophe unfolding in front of him. His eyes were entirely focused on immediate, petty cash. "Look, if this whole corporate buyout thing is falling apart," Nolan said, scratching the back of his neck with a dirty fingernail, "does that mean the demolition is off? Because I already have a buyer lined up in the city who is willing to pay $2,000 cash for the antique brass handles on those library cabinets. I also might have already pulled 3 bottles of that rare vintage Cabernet from the pantry rack while you guys were arguing. I just need to know if I should put them back, or if I can load them into my truck right now." Owen whipped his head around, staring at the grungy cousin as if he had just sprouted a second head. The developer's face flushed a deep, violent purple. "You did what?" Owen roared, his massive frame surging toward the foyer. "You are actively stripping fixtures and stealing expensive wine right now. You utter moron. If this transaction fails, and a single police officer walks through that front door tomorrow morning, this is no longer a civil property dispute. You have turned this entire estate into an active crime scene of felony theft. You have hopelessly contaminated the only asset I actually care about." Vivian grabbed Reed by the forearm, her perfectly manicured nails digging savagely into his expensive wool suit jacket. "Reed, fix this immediately," she hissed, her voice a frantic, breathless whisper that my high-sensitivity microphones picked up perfectly. "You have to force Owen to sign the closing disclosures. We just need his signature and the notary stamp to lock the escrow funds in place tonight. We can manufacture a story for the underwriter tomorrow. We will say Brooklyn had a medical emergency at her retreat and could not reach a phone. We will spin the narrative. Just keep him at the table." But Owen heard every single word of her panicked whispering. The developer let out a harsh, barking laugh that held absolutely zero humor. He looked at Vivian with pure, unadulterated disgust. "Spin the narrative. Manufacture a story." Owen shook his head, taking 2 deliberate steps backward away from the dining table. "I am a ruthless businessman, Vivian, but I am not a suicidal idiot. This does not sound like a complex real estate transaction anymore. This sounds exactly like a desperate, amateur hour scam. I am not wiring millions of dollars into an escrow account based on a forged signature and a missing wife who just happens to be unreachable on the exact night the title insurance company demands to speak with her. I am completely done." "Hold on a second," Russell Pike interrupted, slamming his heavy leather briefcase onto the table with a loud, aggressive thud. The mobile notary pointed a thick, calloused finger directly at Reed's chest. "Nobody is walking out of this house until I get paid in cash, and my fee just tripled. I am sitting in a room with a flashing title file, a fabricated proxy document, a wife who has apparently vanished off the face of the earth, and a family actively stealing historical artifacts from the hallways. The risk premium for my silence just went up to $15,000. You either pay me right now, Reed, or my first phone call when I get back to my car is to the state licensing board to report a massive, coordinated fraud attempt. The walls of the grand dining room were physically closing in on my husband. The carefully constructed, charming persona of the brilliant startup founder completely disintegrated into dust. Reed let out a raw, animalistic scream of pure frustration. He lunged across the hardwood floor, throwing his body against the heavy wooden double doors leading toward the front exit. He spread his arms wide, his chest heaving, his eyes wild and completely unhinged. "Nobody is leaving," Reed screamed, spit flying from his lips as he glared at the room full of his co-conspirators. "Do you understand what I have done to get us to this table? I locked my own wife in a freezing stone bunker. I risked 30 years in federal prison. I have absolutely nothing left. If you walk out that door, Owen, my entire life is over. I am dead. You are going to sit down. You are going to sign those papers, and we are going to take this house tonight." It was the most pathetic, exposing confession a man could ever make. He was no longer trying to convince them he was a reliable partner. He was begging them to participate in his destruction simply because he was too terrified to face it alone. Down in the absolute quiet of the subterranean utility room, I did not feel a single shred of pity. I sat perfectly still in my metal chair, my eyes locked on the glowing screens, my fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard. I meticulously saved every single high-definition video file to my secure encrypted server. I clipped the pristine audio of Celeste demanding her illegal loan repayment. I isolated Nolan's blatant confession of stealing the antique fixtures and the rare vintage wine from my pantry. I highlighted Russell Pike's aggressive extortion demands, spoken clearly into the quiet room. I logged the exact name of the shell company Vivian had mentioned earlier in the evening. They thought they were simply attempting a quick, dirty property theft. But through their own blinding greed and vicious paranoia, they had spent the last hour actively transforming this house into a masterclass of overlapping felony charges. The trap was no longer just sprung. Its consequences had completely broken them. Every single person standing in my dining room had just handed me the exact leverage I needed to bring them down. The camera feed hovering above the grand foyer showed the heavy, custom oak door swinging wide open. Into my home walked Owen Danner. He was the chief executive officer of Cindervale Development, a man whose entire reputation in Loudoun County was built on aggressively swallowing up pristine pastoral land and vomiting out overpriced, soulless luxury subdivisions. He did not bother to wipe his expensive leather loafers on the woven entry mat, tracking dry mud directly onto my antique Persian rug. Tucked tightly under his left arm was a pair of thick, rolled architectural blueprints. He strode into the center of my house with the unmistakable, relaxed swagger of a man who firmly believed he had already purchased the entire hillside, dirt and all. But Owen was not the guest that made the blood freeze in my veins. Trailing right behind him, stepping delicately over the threshold, was a woman dressed in a sweeping emerald silk dress. She looked as though she were arriving at a highly anticipated victory gala rather than participating in a midnight real estate theft. It was Celeste Mercer, my mother-in-law. Following closely behind her, his eyes darting hungrily across my custom mahogany wainscoting and vintage light fixtures, was Nolan, the cousin who had pretended to measure my door hinges just days ago to help out. The scale of this operation suddenly expanded into something terrifyingly vast. This was not just a rogue, desperate husband and his sharp-toothed mistress trying to pull a fast one. It was a highly coordinated, multi-layered family effort to strip me entirely to the bone. I reached out with a trembling hand and toggled the audio master switch on the server rack, feeding the concealed library and dining room microphones directly into my heavy noise-canceling headphones. The voices crackled to life, crystal clear in the quiet utility room. They were gathered around the massive dining table now. I watched Owen unfurl the large paper plans, flattening the edges against the polished wood. I listened, my fingernails digging hard into my palms, as the true, horrifying scope of the conspiracy finally laid itself bare. They did not want to sell Foxbriar House to a wealthy family. They did not even want to flip it to an aggressive corporate investor. They wanted to completely obliterate it. The primary access road has to cut straight through the south vineyard. Owen's deep, booming voice echoed harshly through my headphones. He tapped a heavy gold pen against the paper rendering. But the real prize, the only reason we are standing in this room tonight, is the subterranean aquifer. Our geological surveys confirmed last month that the main artery of the underground spring runs directly beneath the stone foundation of this exact house. Without unlimited, unrestricted access to that water source, the luxury resort project next door is completely dead in the dirt. We absolutely cannot build a high-capacity wellness spa and 36 private plunge pools on a municipal trickle. I paid you a massive, unprecedented premium. Read, to permanently eliminate the obstacle standing in my way. I expect this deed clean, stamped, and recorded by sunrise. And it will be, Owen, Vivian chimed in, her voice dripping with an oily, confident reassurance that made me nauseous. Once the transfer is executed tonight, my firm takes immediate operational control. First thing Monday morning, I have a friendly structural engineer ready to file a highly unfavorable foundation assessment with the county. We will document severe, irreparable moisture damage spreading from the wine cellar and claim the load-bearing stone walls are fatally compromised. The county will condemn the structure within 14 days as a public hazard. We will have the bulldozers on the property and this entire place flattened to dirt in less than 3 weeks. Your excavators will have a clear, legal shot at the aquifer before the end of the month. The breath shuddered violently out of my lungs, catching in my throat. Flattened to dirt, my home, my absolute sanctuary. The years of agonizing restoration, the endless hours spent sourcing authentic materials, all of it reduced to a fabricated mold report and a wrecking ball. Thank God, Celeste said, her voice floating through the audio feed with casual, vicious delight. She accepted a tall glass of expensive champagne from Vivian, taking a celebratory sip. I have spent 5 years watching my brilliant son suffocate under the weight of a woman who guards her assets like a steel bank vault. She never truly supported his vision or his company. She just sat in this drafty old museum, hoarding her paychecks and playing the martyr. It is about time you took back what you rightfully deserve. Read. You are finally cutting the dead weight. Speaking of taking things, Nolan interjected smoothly, leaning casually against the doorframe of the formal dining room. If the house is getting reduced to rubble in 3 weeks anyway, I assume I get first pick of the architectural salvage. That antique brass chandelier in the foyer easily pulls $5,000 at a private auction. And the custom copper gutters outside are worth their weight in scrap alone. Do not let the demolition crew crush the good stuff. Sitting at the far end of the long table, entirely ignored until this exact moment, was Russell Pike. The mobile notary slouched deeply in his upholstered chair, tapping a thick banded stack of $100 bills against his palm. I do not care if you burn the place down or sell it brick by brick, Russell muttered, his voice raspy, cynical, and utterly bored. I am simply here to stamp the proxy document and verify the identification provided on the table. My exorbitant fee covers the ink on my stamp and my absolute, unwavering silence. Whatever moral acrobatics you people are doing to justify stealing a historic house from a missing wife is none of my business. Just make absolutely sure the paperwork has no glaring typographical errors, because I am not losing my state commission over a misspelled middle name or a botched date. I shifted my gaze back to the monitor showing Reed. He was staring down at his hands, resting on the table. I waited for a flicker of hesitation. I waited for the man I married to show a single ounce of remorse for agreeing to aggressively demolish the home we supposedly built our life inside. I waited for him to defend my name against his mother's venom. Instead, Reed looked up at Owen and nodded with a terrifying firmness. I need the capital injection into the Helionest accounts by tomorrow at noon. Owen, I am not just taking a temporary bridge loan against the equity like we initially discussed last year. I am completely wiping her off the map. All of her ridiculous historical preservation, all of her obsessive restorations. I am trading it all so my company can survive the next quarter. I delivered the asset. I locked her away. You deliver the cash. The sheer brutality of the betrayal was a sharp, physical ache in my ribs, radiating through my chest. But the final, shocking revelation came from Owen, and it perfectly explained the frantic, dangerously sloppy execution of their entire plan. The funds are sitting in the escrow account right now. Read, Owen snapped, rolling the thick blueprints back into a tight cylinder and pointing it at my husband like a weapon. But the title must be legally transferred tonight. Not tomorrow afternoon, tonight. The County Water Management Board is holding an emergency legislative session at exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. They are voting on a sweeping district-wide moratorium that will permanently freeze all new commercial water extraction permits. If my corporate entity does not officially own the land above that aquifer before the judge drops the gavel tomorrow morning, the resort cannot draw a single drop of water, and this entire multi-million-dollar deal turns to ash. We are operating on a razor-thin wire. Read, that is exactly why we are doing a midnight closing with a dirty notary and a forged proxy. We are literally racing the sun. I sat back in my metal chair, staring at the screens. The cold concrete walls of the hidden utility room suddenly felt less like a cage and more like a hardened command bunker. The puzzle pieces locked together with a sickening crunch. This was never just a simple property theft. This was a desperate, multi-million-dollar corporate sabotage disguised as a marital betrayal. They were backed against a sheer cliff, utterly dependent on a forged signature, a corrupt family, and a locked cellar door to save their miserable lives before the morning sun exposed them all. The heavy brass doorbell echoed through the upper floors of Foxbriar House, sounding twice in rapid succession. On my surveillance monitor, the chaotic screaming inside the dining room ceased instantly. The panic morphed into a frantic, terrifying scramble. Celeste practically leaped into the corner, attempting to wipe the spilled champagne off her silk dress. Vivian furiously smoothed the edges of the fraudulent documents, arranging them into perfectly aligned stacks. Reed dragged his hands over his face, trying to mold his terrified expression back into the mask of a confident corporate executive. I watched through the foyer camera as Reed pulled open the heavy front door. He was expecting a low-level courier or a standard private money representative to blindly collect the paperwork. Instead, two men stepped over the threshold, and neither of them possessed the relaxed demeanor of an easy mark. The first man introduced himself as a senior agent for the private lending firm. The second man, carrying a thick leather briefcase and wearing wire-rimmed glasses, introduced himself as a risk control specialist sent directly by the title underwriter. My automated packet, silently deployed through the county system, had done its job flawlessly. It had successfully triggered a mandatory, in-person verification protocol. The two men did not offer warm handshakes. They stepped into my hallway and immediately stopped, their eyes scanning the environment with sharp, professional skepticism. They saw the violent streaks of mud tracked across the Persian rug from Owen's ruined leather shoes. They glanced out the front windows at the high-intensity security floodlights blazing across the property and the luxury sedans dripping with thick, wet dirt. They looked back at the dining room, noting the empty champagne flutes, the flushed faces, and the palpable, suffocating tension hanging in the air. Any seasoned real estate professional could smell the rot in this room from 10 feet away. This was not a clean, standard corporate closing. This was a crime scene hastily disguised as a business meeting. Vivian immediately deployed her most lethal weapon, her smooth, honeyed charm. She stepped forward, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor, offering a brilliant practiced smile. "Gentlemen, please come in," Vivian said, gesturing elegantly toward the dining table. "We apologize for the slight disarray. It has been an incredibly fast-paced evening. My name is Vivian Hart, acting broker for the Cellar. We have everything prepared for your review." The title specialist did not smile back. He placed his briefcase squarely on the mahogany table and clicked the latches open. I was informed by my corporate office that the primary property owner, Brooklyn Cox, would be physically present for this transfer due to some late-stage irregularities in the digital file. Unfortunately, Brooklyn is unavailable tonight, Vivian replied smoothly, not missing a single beat. She is currently in New Mexico, attending a highly exclusive silent reset wellness retreat. She has been under a tremendous amount of stress and required a total disconnection from her professional life. She graciously signed a limited power of attorney prior to her departure so her husband could handle the final logistics of this transaction. Reed sat down opposite the two men. I could clearly see the dark, heavy sweat stains blooming under the arms of his expensive wool suit. He forced a wide, strained smile, attempting to play the role of the dutiful, loving spouse. "It is entirely true," Reed said, his voice carrying a slight, nervous tremor. "My wife works incredibly hard. I simply wanted to take the burden of this complex transfer entirely off her shoulders so she could actually rest. I have full authorization to execute the final deeds on her behalf tonight." Down in the hidden utility room, I felt a cold surge of adrenaline. I unhooked my encrypted USB drive from the server tower. It contained every single video and audio recording from the past hour. I gathered the heavy hard copy folders containing the original Blue Ash Holdings, LLC, operating agreement, the original water rights addendum, and the printed confirmation of the electronic fraud alert I had registered with the county clerk. I turned off the monitors, plunging the concrete room into darkness. I walked back down the dirt-floored bottling corridor, moving silently beneath the house. I reached the hidden wooden panel at the far end of the tunnel, which led straight up into the old library located directly behind the main tasting room. I climbed the narrow wooden stairs, clutching the heavy files against my chest, and paused just behind the disguised wainscoting. I was now standing mere inches away from the dining room, separated only by a thin layer of antique wood. The voices were no longer filtered through a digital headset. They were right in front of me, sharp and clear. "This power of attorney document is highly irregular," the title specialist noted, his voice flat and unimpressed. I heard the crisp rustle of heavy paper turning. I am looking at the signature block. The cursive initials on page 4, page 7, and page 12 are entirely inconsistent. The slant and pressure do not match the baseline signature we have on file from her previous title work. There was a heavy pause. "Furthermore," the specialist continued, his tone dropping into a distinctly accusatory register, "the notary acknowledgement block contains two glaring typographical errors regarding the county jurisdiction. A clean licensed operator handling a multi-million-dollar transfer does not make jurisdictional spelling mistakes." I heard Russell Pike shift uncomfortably in his chair. The dirty notary was completely silent, refusing to defend his own fraudulent paperwork against a man who could instantly revoke his state license. Owen slammed his heavy fist against the table, rattling the crystal glasses. He was out of time, and his patience had completely evaporated. "Listen to me," the developer snarled, abandoning any pretense of polite negotiation. "I am injecting a massive amount of capital into this transaction. We are under an extremely strict deadline. The County Water Board meets tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock sharp to permanently freeze all new extraction permits. If this deed is not legally transferred and recorded by the time that meeting begins, the entire adjacent resort development is dead. I am not losing tens of millions of dollars in future revenue because of a sloppy initial or a misspelled word. Reed has the proxy." Pike stamped it. "You are going to sign off on the escrow release right now." The title specialist remained completely unmoved by the aggressive display. "My job is not to facilitate your development timeline, Mr. Danner. My job is to ensure my firm is not underwriting a massive, illegal property theft. Until I speak directly to Brooklyn Cox and hear her voice confirming her absolute consent to this exact transaction, this file remains frozen." "That is completely impossible," Reed shouted, his voice cracking with absolute desperation. "I told you, she is completely off the grid. She is thousands of miles away in a desert without cellular service. You are destroying my life over a bureaucratic technicality. When exactly did she leave for this retreat? The lender representative asked, speaking for the first time. His voice was laced with deep suspicion. I placed my hand firmly against the brass latch of the hidden library panel. I closed my eyes, taking one final, deep breath of the dusty wooden air. She left this afternoon, Reed lied, his voice echoing loudly through the silent house. Right around 4 o'clock. We sat in the kitchen, we had coffee, and my wife explicitly agreed to every single term of this sale before she walked out the front door. It was the stupidest, most fatal lie he could have possibly told. He had dug the grave, poured the concrete, and voluntarily climbed inside. He had locked me in the freezing stone cellar precisely at 4 o'clock. I kept my hand perfectly steady on the latch. I let the absolute silence hang in the dining room for 3 more seconds. I let them stand teetering entirely on the edge of the precipice, their lies completely exhausted, their options reduced to zero. I let the room slip 1/2 step further toward total ruin. Then, I pushed the heavy wooden panel open and stepped out into the light. I need to hear Brooklyn Cox's voice on a recorded line right now, the title specialist demanded, his tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. The heavy oak panel of the hidden library wall clicked sharply. I pushed it open and stepped out into the blinding light of the dining room. I was wearing my sharpest charcoal suit, my hair perfectly in place, not a single speck of subterranean dust on my clothes. If I am currently at a silent retreat in New Mexico, I said, my voice cutting through the thick, tense air like a freshly sharpened blade, then who exactly did my husband lock inside the subterranean wine cellar of this estate 37 minutes ago? Reed physically staggered backward. His knee slammed into a heavy dining chair, sending it screeching violently across the hardwood floor. Vivian dropped her expensive designer pen. It hit the mahogany table with a loud, hollow clatter. The color drained entirely from every single face in the room. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating, and incredibly beautiful. I walked slowly to the head of the table. I did not look at my husband. I looked directly into the eyes of the title specialist. I dropped the heavy manila folders directly onto their fraudulent, meticulously arranged paperwork. Here is the original, wet ink operating agreement for Blue Ash Holdings, LLC, I stated clearly, tapping the thick stack of paper. Here is the active conservation covenant. Here is the strict water rights addendum. And right on top is the official, stamped confirmation of the electronic property fraud alert I personally filed with the Loudoun County Clerk earlier this week. Reed Mercer possesses absolutely zero legal authority to sell, leverage, or alter this property. I did not wait for the stunned professionals to process the paperwork. I walked purposefully over to the massive smart screen mounted in the adjacent living space. I plugged my encrypted USB drive directly into the side port. The screen flickered, and then brilliant, high-definition video flooded the room. It was the time-stamped security footage from the Cellar landing. The entire room watched in horrified silence as the video played. They saw Reed slam the heavy steel door. They heard the brutal scrape of the unauthorized secondary lock. They heard Vivian explicitly extorting me for the digital authorization code, openly discussing the forged proxy documents, and frantically stressing the absolute necessity of beating the morning water permit deadline. Stop the transaction immediately, the title specialist ordered. He aggressively shoved the forged documents away from his chest, as if the paper itself were coated in toxic poison. He snapped his leather briefcase shut with a loud crack. This file is completely dead. We are legally withdrawing from this entire negotiation. The private lender representative stood up without saying a single word. He buttoned his suit jacket and swiftly moved toward the front door, eager to escape the radioactive blast zone. Owen Danner stood frozen, staring blankly at the smart screen. The aggressive, arrogant developer finally realized he had not walked into a high-speed corporate acquisition. He had walked blindly into a meticulously documented, multi-million-dollar felony trap. "You set me up!" Reed screamed, finally finding his voice as the sheer terror broke through his shock. He spun wildly toward Vivian, pointing a shaking, sweaty finger right at her face. "This was your idea. You told me the proxy would clear. You told me we could trap her downstairs and force the sale." Vivian bared her teeth like a rabid, cornered animal. "Do not try to pin this entirely on me. You pathetic failure," she shrieked, entirely abandoning her polished, sophisticated persona. "You are the one who begged me to find a way to liquidate your wife's assets. You are the one who actively agreed to completely demolish the historic cellar and route the escrow cash through my shell companies just to hide it from your furious investors. You wanted her erased. They were burying each other alive right there on my expensive Persian rug. They were loudly confessing to federal financial crimes, fraudulent corporate structures, and conspiracy in front of 2 licensed real estate officials and a very angry property developer. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Russell Pike slowly backing away from the far end of the table. The dirty mobile notary clutched his briefcase tightly to his chest, attempting to silently slip toward the rear service hallway. Just as Pike reached the archway, the heavy front door swung open with a massive, authoritative crash. My lawyer, Mara Sutter, strode into the grand foyer. Flanking her on either side were 2 fully uniformed deputies from the Loudoun County Sheriff's Office. Mara had received my automated evidence packet exactly on time. "Nobody is leaving this house," Mara announced, her voice echoing with absolute legal authority. She looked at me, gave a sharp, professional nod, and then turned to the deputies. "Officers, we have a fully documented case of unlawful imprisonment, attempted grand larceny, and real estate fraud." The scene instantly shifted from a chaotic, toxic family dispute into a highly controlled legal triage. I pointed directly across the room at Nolan, who was pathetically trying to hide his tall frame behind a potted indoor ficus tree. "Officers," I said calmly, "before anyone leaves this property, I need you to search that man's truck parked on the side lawn. He has a box containing 3 bottles of rare vintage wine, a heavy silver service set from my pantry, and several antique brass fixtures he physically stripped from my library cabinets tonight." Nolan turned the color of wet ash. One deputy immediately grabbed him by the arm and escorted him out the front door into the blinding security lights. Less than 3 minutes later, the officer returned carrying my silver and the stolen wine. The attempted paper theft had just escalated into immediate, physical grand larceny. With the stolen goods recovered directly from the suspect's vehicle, the deputies moved in. The harsh, metallic, ratcheting sound of heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut echoed beautifully through my dining room. They cuffed Reed first. My husband wept openly, his pathetic tears soaking his expensive shirt collar, completely broken by the realization that his fraudulent facade was permanently destroyed. They cuffed Vivian next, securing her wrists tightly behind her tailored suit as she continued to scream vicious profanities at Reed. They detained Russell Pike, ordering him to sit firmly on the sofa while they confiscated his notary stamp and his briefcase full of cash as active criminal evidence. Owen Danner did not say a single word. He picked up his thick architectural blueprints, his face a tight mask of profound humiliation, and practically sprinted out the front door, desperate to distance his development company from the spectacular legal fallout. Celeste stood frozen near the dining table, her emerald silk dress completely ruined by the spilled champagne. She looked at her son sobbing in handcuffs, and then she slowly turned to look at me. "Brooklyn," she whispered, her voice trembling with sudden, pathetic fragility. "Please." I looked at my mother-in-law with absolutely zero empathy. "You are officially trespassing on my private property. Celeste. If you do not walk out that front door in the next 10 seconds, I will ask the deputies to place a 4th pair of handcuffs on your wrists." She turned and fled into the dark. 6 months later, the dust finally settled into stone. The fallout was absolute and devastating. Reed lost his startup entirely. His furious investors aggressively sued him into personal bankruptcy, and he is currently awaiting trial for federal wire fraud and unlawful imprisonment. Vivian had her real estate broker license permanently revoked by the state board and is facing severe conspiracy charges. Nolan pleaded guilty to felony theft to avoid a much longer prison sentence. As for me, I am standing right where I belong. I reopened the heavy steel door to my subterranean wine cellar. I completely removed the secondary lock they used to trap me. I brought down 2 comfortable leather chairs and a small antique reading table. It is no longer just a storage facility. It is my private tasting library. Tonight, I poured myself a glass of the exact 1998 Reserve Cabernet that Nolan tried to steal. I sat in the cool, perfectly climate-controlled air, surrounded by the rough, historic stone walls. I took a slow sip, letting the rich, complex flavors settle on my tongue. Reed and Vivian thought they were incredibly smart. They thought they were locking a helpless woman in the dark to steal her empire. But as I sit here now, breathing the clean air of my fully restored home, I understand the absolute, beautiful irony of that night. When they violently slammed that heavy cellar door shut, they did not lock me inside. They permanently locked themselves out. Thank you so much for listening to my story tonight. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please drop your city or country in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts on this crazy situation. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to Violet Revenge Stories. Hit that like button and give this video a hype so this story can reach even more people.